The world stands on the brink of disaster. Every second counts. Do you have the courage to change fate? In December 2022, Dan Foster, a former Green Beret and current biology teacher, is on the phone hoping to secure a job in a laboratory. As he walks into his home, a Christmas party is in full swing. His wife, Emmy, asks him to help with the preparations, but Dan is preoccupied, confident he'll land the job of his dreams. Emmy mentions that their daughter, Muri, received a letter from Dan's estranged father. Frustrated, Dan immediately throws it away, telling Emmy his father has lost the right to be a grandfather. He steps outside to finish the call but learns he didn't get the job, leaving him dejected.
We found someone else. Sorry.
Dan returns to the party and sits with Muri to watch the World Cup. He tells her the players on TV are the best in the world, and she says she wants to be the best too. Dan encourages her, saying she'll need to do what no one else is willing to do to achieve greatness. Suddenly, a bright portal opens on the football field, and soldiers emerge from it. To everyone's shock, they announce they are from the year 2051 and plead for help in a war against an alien race called the White Claws that has nearly destroyed humanity.
You are our last hope.
Months later, global military forces begin sending troops to the future, but losses are staggering. Only a quarter of those sent return. Desperate, nations begin conscripting civilians, though even fewer of them survive. Public opinion grows divided on the war effort. One day, Dan is teaching a distracted biology class. To inspire his students, he asks what excites them. A boy named Martin answers, sharing his passion for volcanoes. Others scoff, doubting the importance of learning when the world is destined to end in 30 years. Dan counters, telling them that the world needs scientists now more than ever. Suddenly, his phone buzzes with a notification. He must confirm his enlistment status. Alarmed, he heads to a military processing station where he is informed of his eligibility. The officer explains that Dan's predicted death in 7 years makes him eligible for recruitment.
Was it a driving test?
It is not.
Despite his protests, they attach a device to his arm, which cannot be removed until he returns from the war in 2051. The process is abrupt, leaving him with more questions than answers. Dan tells Emmy what happened. She is horrified and suggests running from the government. Dan doesn't think it's possible, but Emmy reminds him he knows someone who might help. Reluctantly, Dan visits a man at an aircraft hangar, a man revealed to be his estranged father, James. James, sarcastic and aloof, prepares to remove the device from Dan's arm. Their conversation grows tense as Dan accuses his father of never supporting him when he needed it.
What did you just say to me?
Furious, Dan storms off, demanding James never contact Muri again. Returning home, Dan admits to Emmy that the device is still on his arm. Saddened, she tells him he must tell Muri. In the backyard, Dan finds Muri digging and explains he's leaving on a trip. Realizing he's been drafted, she becomes emotional. Dan reassures her, promising he will return.
I will be back.
He hugs her tightly, trying to mask his fear as he prepares to leave his family behind for an uncertain future. Before jumping into the future, Dan and the others are introduced to their team and given basic training in weaponry and first aid. The soldiers from 20051 conduct the sessions, aiming to boost the recruits' survival chances. Dan meets Charlie, a nervous scientist who talks excessively, and Dorian, a seasoned veteran who has already survived 2 jumps to 2051. Surprised by Dorian's survival, Dan questions Charlie about it. Charlie explains that very few ever return from the future. As they observe the young soldiers leading the training, Dan and Charlie realize all recruits sent to the future are over 40. They conclude this is to avoid creating a temporal paradox. The recruits learn that the White Claws, the aliens they are fighting, disappear every 6 days to rest. This period, called Saturday by the future soldiers, is when new recruits are sent to 20051, spending 7 days there before returning. That night, Charlie shares his tragic story about his wife, who was sent on the first jump and never came back.
She got sent out in the first wave.
I'm really sorry.
An alarm suddenly blares. The young soldiers scream that this is not a drill. Dan learns from Lieutenant Hart that the last research facility in 2051 is under attack, and losing it will mean the war is lost. The recruits are rushed to the portal room, where they prepare for their jump to the future. Dan shows Charlie how to disable his weapon safety lock, ensuring he can defend himself. The portal activates, and people are sucked into it. However, there is a malfunction in the destination coordinates, causing the recruits to drop high above Miami instead of on solid ground. Dan, Charlie, and Dorian land safely in a rooftop pool atop a skyscraper, but many others aren't as fortunate. The survivors regroup, shaken by the disaster. Looking over the edge of the rooftop, Dan sees Miami in ruins, overrun by the White Claws. Romeo Command contacts the team, recognizing Dan's military experience. They inform him that the area will be bombed due to the overwhelming alien presence. However, Dan is assigned a critical rescue mission to save isolated scientists trapped in a nearby building. Dan organizes the remaining recruits, dividing them into smaller units. He sends Nora and Cowan ahead to scout the route. They confirm the path is clear, and the group cautiously moves forward. As they approach the building, they find fallen soldiers and signs of heavy alien activity. Inside the building, they search for the scientists. Romeo Command warns them that the White Claws can smell blood from miles away. The team eventually finds the scientists' bodies. They are all dead. The mission shifts to retrieving biological samples and hard drives from the lab. While gathering the samples, Nora and Cowan alert the team that White Claws are approaching.
Guys, something's watching us.
Romeo Command warns them that aircraft will bomb the area in 6 minutes. Dan orders the team to regroup on the 7th floor and prepare for an emergency evacuation. The team uses a fire escape stairwell to leave the building. Suddenly, they hear eerie noises. The White Claws attack from above, forcing the group into a frantic retreat. Dan fights one of the creatures alone, but struggles to overcome it until Dorian steps in, killing it and revealing its weak points, the neck and belly. With the White Claws closing in, the team fights to stay ahead of their attackers. Each floor brings new challenges, but Dan's leadership and Dorian's experience help them push forward. Their survival hangs by a thread as they race against the clock to escape the building before it's destroyed. As the aerial attack draws near, Romeo Command sends vehicles to extract the team. However, the White Claws overwhelm the vehicles, killing several team members. Despite fierce resistance, the team struggles to hold their ground, barely managing to fend off the relentless aliens. With the airstrike imminent, Dan's group, now reduced to 7 members, fights to escape both the White Claws and the explosions. In a tunnel where an F-22 Raptor is set to drop bombs, Cowan and Nora get injured. Realizing the team's survival depends on delaying the aliens, they heroically sacrifice themselves. Cowan and Nora stay behind, firing at the White Claws while urging the others to flee. The remaining 5 members narrowly escape the collapsing tunnel just before the airstrike obliterates the area. A day later, Dan wakes up at a military base in the Caribbean alongside Charlie. They reunite with Dorian, who explains that they were the only 3 survivors. Dan notices Dorian carrying a White Claw Talon as a keepsake and asks about it. Dorian reveals he has terminal cancer with only 6 months to live and returns to 2051 repeatedly to die on his own terms. Dan is summoned to meet Colonel Muri Forester, who is revealed to be his grown-up daughter. Shocked, Dan learns she has a PhD in biotechnology from MIT. Although proud, he is taken aback when she explains that she brought him to the future solely to help with a critical mission. In a military tent, Muri shows Dan a toxin they've developed, which only kills male White Claws. To create a toxin effective against females, they need to capture one. Dan agrees to assist and joins Muri on a mission to capture a female White Claw at a nearby nest. During the helicopter ride, Muri explains how the White Claws appeared without warning, emerging from northern Russia and spreading worldwide. Despite extensive research, no evidence of ships, drop sites, or any other origin has ever been found. Dan asks about their family's past, but Muri avoids the topic. At the White Claw nest, the military has cornered a female White Claw. As they attempt to cage it, the creature breaks free, attacking the soldiers. Muri descends into the nest to help, but the situation worsens as Dan sees a horde of male White Claws approaching from the helicopter. Dan also descends to assist. He grabs one of the female White Claw's tentacles, enraging her and tricking her into shooting spines at herself. With the distraction, the team gains the upper hand and successfully traps the female in a cage. The helicopter takes off with the captured alien. As Dan and Muri exit the nest, more White Claws arrive. They run to a military vehicle, using a heavy machine gun to clear a path. After a tense chase, they reach a beach and escape the vehicle. There, Muri scolds Dan for risking his life, as she needs him alive for their mission. Dan counters, saying he couldn't watch his daughter, or anyone else, be devoured. Muri then opens up about their family's past, revealing that Dan left her and Emmy in 2022. Dan insists he would never abandon his family, but Muri continues, explaining how the separation led to divorce. She recalls her 16th birthday, when she hoped Dan might return and fix their family. Instead, she received a devastating call that he had died in an accident. At the hospital, she watched his heartbeat fade on the monitor. Dan is heartbroken, left speechless by the tragedy. A helicopter arrives, taking them to an ocean base where the next phase of their mission awaits. Dan, burdened by what he's learned about his future, silently resolves to ensure his efforts in 2051 will make a difference. While Dan reflects on what Muri revealed, he arrives at the ocean base. In her lab, Muri is racing to synthesize a toxin to kill the female White Claws. They're testing thousands of combinations, hoping for a breakthrough. Dan asks if she has a way to mass-produce the toxin, but her response remains cryptic. With only 21 hours before Dan is sent back to his time, he offers to help. Muri insists it's a one-person job. Dan reassures her, saying Emmy would be proud of her, just as he is. The next day, Dan returns to the lab, determined to fulfill his purpose. Muri finally explains why Dan is crucial. Once they create the toxin, he must take it back to 2022 to ensure mass production. This would prevent the future war from ever happening. Moments later, the computer announces a successful test. The toxin is 100% effective. Before they can celebrate, the captured female White Claw awakens, screaming loudly. Suddenly, thousands of White Claws begin invading the base. Grabbing weapons, Dan and Muri race toward the helipad, fighting off the creatures while carrying the precious vial of toxin. As they fight their way through, Muri is hit by a White Claw spine, leaving her unable to walk. Dan supports her, determined not to leave her behind, but the automated facility voice warns that the time jump will activate in 3 minutes. Bleeding heavily, Muri urges Dan to leave her and complete the mission. He refuses, desperate to save her. She apologizes.
Sorry I said all those things to you. I'm so happy I got to see you like this.
Dan is heartbroken. With less than a minute until the jump, Muri hands Dan the vial. A White Claw attacks, and the ground beneath them collapses. Muri and the alien begin sliding toward the edge. Dan leaps to save her, grabbing her hand, but she slips and falls. In sheer desperation, Dan jumps after her, but mid-leap, he's teleported back to 2022. He wakes up clutching the vial of toxin. Lieutenant Hart informs him the portal is inactive and no one can return to the future. Charlie, who also survived, sits nearby. When Dan returns home, he tearfully embraces his young daughter, Muri. She's overjoyed to see him safe. That night, Dan tells Emmy about meeting Muri in the future and creating the toxin. He mentions the mystery of the White Claw's origins. Emmy suggests the creatures may have arrived long before 2048, which sparks an idea in Dan's mind. He visits Dorian, who agrees to help him prevent the war. They take the White Claw talon Dorian wears and bring it to Charlie for analysis. Charlie discovers volcanic ash on the talon, but it's from China, not Russia. Puzzled, Dan wonders how Chinese volcanic ash ended up in Russia. Charlie asks if Dan knows a volcano expert. Dan remembers someone and gathers the group to meet Martin. At Dan's school, the trio asks Martin how a creature from Russia could have Chinese volcanic ash on its claws. Martin explains that it must have come from the Millennium Eruption,
What the hell is that?
a massive volcanic event that occurred 1,000 years ago. Martin explains that volcanic ash from the Millennium eruption can still be found in deep ice in northern Russia.
I love this kid.
The team concludes that the White Claws arrived during that time, became frozen, and were only released when the ice melted by 2048. They request funding from the U.S. Air Force for a secret mission in Russia but are denied. Dan then turns to his estranged father, James, for help. Surprisingly, James agrees without hesitation and they prepare for the mission. The team, including Lieutenant Hart, boards James's plane with a large supply of toxin. Arriving in northern Russia, they switch to snowmobiles and head toward the suspected location of the White Claw's emergence. Suddenly, they encounter interference that disables their instruments, including compasses. They detonate the ice, opening a fissure, and discover a massive alien ship trapped in the ice. Dan warns James and Charlie to be ready for anything. Dan and a few others enter the ship and find an alien race, not White Claws, frozen inside. Moving deeper, they locate a chamber filled with White Claws, clearly cargo for these other aliens. They inject some with toxin, killing them instantly. However, the remaining White Claws begin to wake up. Before they can inject them all, several break free and head for the exit. Dan alerts James and Charlie, who manage to stop 3, but 1 escapes. Inside, the team retrieves C4 explosives to destroy the ship. Dorian gives Dan his White Claw Talon, urging him to save his family. The remaining team inside fights off a massive colony of awakening White Claws. Realizing the situation is hopeless, Dorian sacrifices himself, detonating the C4. The explosion destroys the ship and all the White Claws inside. Meanwhile, Dan returns to James and Charlie, who inform him that the escaping White Claw is a female. Determined to stop it, Dan and James pursue the White Claw on snowmobiles. They split up, and Dan soon sees the creature charging at James. James sets a trap using a decoy and fires at it from a distance. Despite the trap, the White Claw targets James. Dan intervenes, crashing his snowmobile into the creature. They shoot at it repeatedly, forcing it to retreat. It falls off a cliff, but they suspect it's still alive. And they're right. The White Claw ambushes them, shooting a spine into Dan's leg. As it charges, Dan and James shoot at its eyes, temporarily blinding it. Dan injects it with toxin, but the creature tears off its arm to stop the toxin spread. The White Claw targets Dan, but James cuts his own hand, luring the creature with the scent of his blood. As the creature attacks James, Dan leaps onto it, stabbing it with Dorian's talon and injecting toxin directly into its mouth. Dan kicks the creature off the cliff, finally killing it. Exhausted, Dan and James collapse in the snow. Charlie arrives to help, and the 3 return home. Dan embraces his family and introduces Muri to her grandfather. As the scene fades, Dan's voice narrates his promise never to leave his family again. He reflects on the value of love, resilience, and the bonds that define his